I used to think I knew my husband better than I knew myself. After 35 years of marriage, how could I not? We'd raised 2 children together, paid off a mortgage, weathered layoffs and surgeries, and every small indignity that comes with aging. We had routines so deeply worn into our lives that even our silences had structure. Mornings began with the kettle boiling. He'd read the newspaper, glasses low on his nose, while I fussed with the garden just outside the kitchen window. Evenings were slow, predictable. Dinner at 6. Dishes by 6:30. The TV humming quietly by 7. There wasn't much passion, no, but there was peace. And at 60, peace felt like a victory. Until the night of our anniversary party. It was our 35th. The children insisted on throwing something small. Just close friends and family. I agreed, partly because I knew they needed a reason to visit and partly because, well, maybe I needed it too. A reminder that we had, in fact, built a full life together. Everyone came. My sister, the neighbors, some of our oldest friends. But I kept catching eyes with one person in particular, Thomas. He and my husband had been best friends since college. The kind of bond that outlasted distance, divorces, and decades. Thomas had always been the honest one, the blunt one. If you didn't want the truth, you didn't ask Thomas. And that night he looked off, not in a loud way, but he barely touched his drink, kept glancing toward my husband with an expression I couldn't quite place. Concern, guilt. After the guests started to trickle out. I was in the kitchen clearing champagne glasses when I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Margaret," he said, voice low. "Can we talk? Just the 2 of us." I followed him outside. The night was cool, the kind that hums quietly between laughter and silence. He didn't look at me right away, just exhaled slowly, like he was carrying something heavy and didn't know where to place it. "I've been meaning to say this for a long time," he began. "And I wanted Richard to tell you himself, but he won't. He's too proud, or maybe too scared. But you deserve to know," I swallowed. "No, what?" He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt the air between us shift. "He's sick, Margaret. Has been for years. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you to worry. But it's bad, and that's not all." My mouth went dry. Thomas hesitated, then added, "There's more. Things he's kept from you. About who he used to be. About who he wanted to be. Before everything." I took a step back. "What are you talking about?" "He gave up everything. His dream. His life's work. And I think deep down, he's never stopped grieving that choice. He's lived a quiet life, but not always a happy one." I shook my head. No, we're happy. We've had a good life, haven't we?" He looked away. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but it's time you saw the whole picture, even if it hurts." And that was when I realized I didn't know my husband at all. What would you do if someone told you your entire marriage wasn't what it seemed? Have you ever discovered a secret that changed everything? Tell me where you're listening from today. Drop your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss how Margaret uncovers a life she never knew her husband lived. After that night, I moved through the house like a stranger. Every familiar room suddenly felt unfamiliar, like each corner held a secret I had never been invited into. I didn't say anything to Richard. I couldn't. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was stunned, suspended somewhere between disbelief and dread. He still made his tea every morning, still read the paper, still offered his quiet smile when our eyes met across the breakfast table. But now, I looked harder. I saw the pale tint of his skin, the way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted his cup. I noticed how he got winded going up the stairs, how often he sat down after short tasks, and how his appetite had slowly dwindled without me realizing. And I thought, how long has this been happening right in front of me? 3 years? Thomas had said. 3 years of doctor visits I never knew about. 3 years of living beside someone who was slowly dying while pretending to be fine. I started, remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time. The sudden work trips he took on his own, the locked drawer in his study, the refusal to join his old art club for their yearly reunion, art. That word lingered in the back of my mind like a loose thread. I knew he used to sketch when we were younger. He'd drawn something once for our wedding invitation, a watercolor of our first apartment. I remember loving it. I remember him brushing it off like it didn't matter. I never asked again. I spent the next few days watching, listening, trying not to break apart. One morning, after he left for a walk, I stood in front of his study. The door was unlocked. I walked in and looked at the desk. The locked drawer was still there, and for the first time in 35 years, I picked the lock. Inside were rows of pill bottles, medical reports, scan results. I didn't understand all the terms, but I didn't need to. The truth was right, there in black and white, stage 4. My knees buckled, but I didn't cry. Not yet. Underneath the paperwork, I found something wrapped in cloth, a sketchbook. I opened it, expecting medical notes, but instead I found page after page of drawings. Delicate, aching, beautiful. Some unfinished, others vibrant with color and life. Portraits of me, of our children, of places I barely remembered, but he'd somehow captured perfectly. And then I saw something that stopped my breath. It was a drawing of me, but not now, not at 60. I was young in this image, barefoot in the kitchen, bathed in golden light from the window. I'd forgotten that version of me. He hadn't. I closed the book slowly and sat down at his desk. In that moment, I felt a sadness I'd never known. Not because he was dying, but because I had spent so many years thinking our life together was simple, quiet, complete, when underneath there had been this entire world I had never been invited into, and I started to wonder, if someone can love you that much, and still hide so much from you. Do you really know them at all? I didn't leave the study for hours. The sketchbook rested on my lap like something sacred. Something that had always been there. But I had never noticed, not because it was hidden, but because I'd stopped looking. When Richard came home, I acted normal. I made dinner. We talked about the weather. He didn't mention the unlocked drawer, and I didn't tell him I had seen everything. I needed time, but I couldn't unsee what I saw, and I couldn't unknow what I now knew. So the next day, I did something I hadn't done in years. I climbed into the attic, the place where we kept old photo albums, forgotten boxes, and dusty memories we didn't talk about anymore. I dug through bins marked holiday decorations, kids' keepsakes, tax returns, until I found a small leather portfolio with Richard's name written in neat block letters. Inside were drawings from decades ago, pencil sketches, charcoal studies, full watercolor landscapes. But these weren't just hobbyist doodles. They were technical, expressive, precise. The kind of work you don't just stumble into. You study for it, you train, and then, tucked inside the back cover, I found a folded letter. I opened it carefully. It was an acceptance letter from an art school in Paris. dated 1 year before we got married. I sat back on the floor, surrounded by insulation dust and old baby clothes, holding the proof of a life Richard had once imagined for himself. A life I had never known. I didn't cry then either. I was too angry. Not at him. Not exactly. But at the silence, the choices, the way we had both drifted into this comfortable version of love, never once asking, "Is this enough? Is this still true?" I needed someone to talk to. So I called our oldest son. We hadn't had a real conversation in months, maybe longer. When I asked, "Did you know your father once wanted to be an artist?" he didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. "He used to draw a lot when we were little. I remember asking him why he didn't do it anymore, and he said it didn't fit into the life he chose." I felt my breath catch. "He told you that?" I asked. "Yeah. I thought you knew." But I didn't, and I realized then I wasn't just grieving Richard's illness. I was grieving all the versions of him I never got the chance to love. That night, after he went to bed, I went back into the study. Not to read more medical files, but to look. There were more sketchbooks, hidden behind old tax folders. 4 of them, each one more confident than the last. His style evolving over time, his voice deepening on the page, even if it never did in our conversations. I opened the last page of the last book and found a note scribbled in his handwriting. "When the time comes, I hope she sees me. Not just the man I became, but the boy I once was. And I knew then, the silence between us could no longer stay. I waited until I was ready, not angry, not panicked, just ready. Ready to hear everything, and ready to say what I'd spent weeks keeping buried beneath small talk and steady hands. That evening I made his favorite meal: braised short ribs, mashed potatoes, buttered green beans. I didn't try to make it a special occasion. I just needed the setting to feel familiar, safe, not staged. We sat across from each other, the dining table between us. The low hum of the dishwasher was the only sound in the room. Halfway through the meal, I set my fork down. "I know, Richard." He didn't look up right away, but when he did, he didn't pretend. He didn't ask, "Know what?" He just closed his eyes, as if something heavy inside him had finally landed. "How much?" he asked. "Everything," I said. "The drawer, the hospital visits, the sketchbooks, the letter from Paris." He nodded quietly. "I didn't want to lie to you, Margaret," he said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "I just didn't want to take away the peace." "The peace," I repeated. "Is that what this was to you? Peace?" He looked up then. It was quiet, safe, full of kindness, but also full of things I didn't know how to say. "Why didn't you just tell me?" "I didn't want you to feel like you were the reason I gave it up." I inhaled, steadying myself. "Were you happy with me?" His eyes filled instantly. "Yes, but I was also incomplete, and I thought I had to choose." I stood up and walked into his study. A moment later, I returned with the sketchbook. I laid it gently on the table between us. "You were choosing this," I said, "every day, even in secret." He reached for the book but didn't open it. "I painted when you were asleep," he said, "or when you were out with the kids. I painted when the ache got too loud. It wasn't rebellion. It was survival." "And now?" I asked. "Now that I know?" He met my gaze, his voice breaking. "Now I feel free." Silence hung in the air between us, thick and trembling. finally I said. "How long?" He didn't flinch. "The doctors gave me 6 months. That was 2 months ago." A chill ran through me, like winter air sneaking into a warm room. "You were just going to fade away?" I asked, not accusing, just heartbroken. "I was going to keep waking up next to you," he said, "drinking tea with you, watching you laugh at something small, until I couldn't anymore." I walked over and took his hand. His fingers were thinner now, his skin colder than I remembered. "I want what's left," I said softly. "But I want all of it." No more silence. He nodded. Then, almost shyly, he stood and walked to the cabinet in the hallway, the one I'd never paid much attention to. He opened it and slowly pulled out canvas after canvas, rolled and wrapped with twine. We unrolled them one by one on the living room floor. Self-portraits, landscapes, imagined cities, sketches of our children, younger than they were now. 12 different versions of me, smiling, tired, angry, lost in thought, and one painting I'd never seen before. It was me, sitting at the kitchen table, head tilted in the morning light, reaching for a mug of tea with that half-aware sleepiness I always tried to hide. "I painted this the week you turned 50, he said. "You looked so peaceful that morning." I didn't want to forget. We sat there side by side, surrounded by the life he'd lived in color when the rest of us only saw black and white. "I've never stopped loving you," he said, "even when I disappeared into myself." "And I never stopped loving you," I whispered, "even when I didn't know where you'd gone." That night, we didn't talk about cancer. We talked about Paris, about the things he once dreamed of, about the person he used to be, and the person I was too busy to notice. And then we held hands and promised each other this. Whatever time was left, we'd live it all. We didn't rush. There were no bucket lists, no grand declarations or dramatic goodbyes. Just quiet mornings and careful moments, like we were learning how to live all over again, with the knowledge that time was finite and more precious than we'd ever allowed ourselves to believe. I moved his art supplies into the living room, the space that used to be formal, untouched, for guests, became his studio. The good rug was rolled up, the couch was pushed to the side, canvases leaned against the walls, jars of brushes and palettes filled the coffee table. Light poured in from the windows and danced on the floor like it belonged to him. And maybe it did. Every morning he painted. He painted while I made breakfast, while I read aloud to him, while the radio played soft classical music. Sometimes he painted in silence. Sometimes he'd ask me to sit where the sun hit just right. Other times he painted from memory. He painted me more times in those weeks than in our entire marriage. He told me once, "I'm trying to remember you, every version of you, because I don't want to forget." And I told him, "I'm learning how to see you again. Not the man I married, but the one you were before all this." We began talking like new lovers, not out of flirtation but discovery. We talked about things we'd never dared ask in the early years, about fear, about faith, about the little griefs of daily life, of being overlooked, overworked, misunderstood, about how easy it is to love someone and still not really know them. And then one day I called Thomas. I asked if he could help me plan something small but meaningful. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'll take care of it." 2 weeks later, we held an art show. It wasn't in a grand gallery in Paris. It was in the back room of a quiet little cafe, 1 block from where Richard used to buy his paints. We invited our children, a few close friends, and people from the neighborhood. Richard sat on a stool near the entrance, a blue scarf around his neck, and paint still smudged on his hands. People walked through slowly, pausing at each piece. There were landscapes of places we'd traveled to, imagined portraits of people he said he'd dreamed about but never met. And then there were the paintings of me. So many versions. In the kitchen, in the garden, reading by the window, laughing, even when I didn't remember laughing. But it was the final painting that stopped everyone. It was me, sitting alone at our kitchen table, one hand wrapped around a cup of tea, the other reaching toward the sunlight spilling in through the window. No smile, no drama, just peace. When someone asked him what it was called, he answered without hesitation, Margaret, in her own light. That night, after the show, we walked home slowly. He held my hand like it was the first time. And when we got home, he sat in his chair by the window and whispered, "That was the happiest I've been in years." "I know," I said, and I meant it. He passed on a Sunday morning. I found him just before sunrise in his chair by the window, the last painting still on the easel beside him. His brush had fallen to the floor. His scarf was tucked neatly around his shoulders. He looked peaceful, like he'd finished something he'd waited his whole life to begin. There was no panic, no moment of shock, just stillness. I sat beside him, took his hand in mine, and whispered, "Thank you. Not for staying, not for surviving, but for showing me the parts of him he thought he had to hide, and for letting me love him anyway." In the weeks that followed, the house was quiet in a different way. Not empty, just full of echoes. His paintings still hung on the walls. His brushes stayed in their jars. I couldn't bring myself to move them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Thomas came by often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Grief sat between us like an old friend. We respected it, but we didn't let it speak for us. One afternoon, a month after the funeral, Thomas said, "You know, he once told me you were the bravest person he ever knew." I looked at him, startled. "Why would he say that?" I asked. "Because you stayed," he said. "Even when you didn't know the whole story. Even when you finally did." That night, I walked into the studio and stood in front of the final painting, the one Richard never finished. It was a field of wildflowers. Open, untamed, glowing with a strange kind of joy. There were no people, just wind and light and color. I picked up one of his brushes, and for the first time in my life, I dipped it in paint. My hand trembled. But then, it didn't, and I began to paint. Not because I knew how, not because I wanted to be like him, but because I wanted to keep something alive. Not just his memory, but the courage it takes to begin again, even after you think the best parts of your story have already been told. 6 months later, I opened a small art studio. Nothing fancy. Just a storefront with soft lighting, a back room filled with canvases, and a sign in the window that read, "Light Reclaimed." People came, at first just to look, but then they started painting too. Women in their 50s, men in their 60s, widows, retirees, people who hadn't touched a brush since childhood, people who thought their time had passed, and I'd tell them softly, "It hasn't. You're still here. That means something." One morning I stood by the window of the studio, holding a mug of tea, watching the sun warm the sidewalk. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to return. I felt whole. I may have lost the love of my life, but in doing so, I found the parts of me I'd buried too, right beside his, and I knew Some love stories don't end. They just change forms, and some beginnings wear the face of goodbye. He used to say I was his light. What he didn't know is that he gave mine back to me. This story wasn't about anger. It was about truth. What did Margaret's journey make you feel? Comment 2 if this story touched your heart. Comment 7 if it made you see your own relationships differently. Or just tell me, what would you have done? And if you believe it's never too late to rediscover love, never too late to start again, please like this video and subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories. Your next favorite story is already on its way.